Thanks to everybody who came. You are the most important part of this occasion. I also would like to thank all the organizers, Claude, who is not here, and Ali, who has been doing most of the work that I have seen through email, but there are others, of course. So I want to thank all of them, without whom this would not have been possible. Brevity may or may not be the soul of anything, including wit, but it does help, I think, in the sense that it prevents people from falling asleep during a talk. So I will be brief. In order to do so, this outline which I have just prepared, I will mostly focus on parts 3 and 4. But I want to just run quickly through the first few slides. Next one is a brief partial history of UDHR. And I won't cover any of this. I'm sure you can get the slides from Ali, and I'll be very happy to discuss during the discussion period. And the others here also are good students of history. So I think we can have a very interesting historical discussion. And in the next slide, I have discussed the role of some post-UDHR documents, and again there is a list, and there's more to come, and mostly I want to talk about the future, but I do want to warn people, including myself, that future is always uncertain, and a lot depends really on us. In that sense, I want to be an optimist. We have that old saying that an optimist thinks that this is the best of all possible worlds, and the pessimist is afraid that the optimist is right. Well, I'm not that kind of an optimist, so I just wanted to make that clear. In the next slide, slide number 6, I have a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt's memoirs, which is quite interesting, and you should read it. You should read her whole memoir, because she really was a great fighter for human rights and a great person. But I want to mention Hansa Mehta, who was perhaps not the only woman, but one of the most important women who actually took part in the deliberations, and it was because of her that we have the expression human rights and not man's rights. The famous French declaration was, as you recall, the Declaration of Rights of Man, which was then responded to by Olympe de Gouges, and she was quite right to have pointed out. But my main argument, it's abbreviated. I'm actually writing a book, so I will elaborate on all this, and some published work already does so, is to argue for a transition from sophisticated liberalism to democratic socialism. And much was mentioned, although briefly, by Michelin, about an inclusive kind of conversation, and I think I can provide one part of that inclusive conversation by focusing on this kind of transition. And a theoretical pathway for that is the idea of taking a particular kind of liberalism, which really has its beginnings, at least in sophisticated form, in John Stuart Mill, but in some ways it precedes even John Stuart Mill, but focuses not just on toleration, but on reducing harms, and construction of an actual political ethical community. We can go back to Hegel, who, by the way, also said that we learn from history that we don't learn from history. I don't actually think that is quite true, and also it's not quite true of Hegel either, otherwise he wouldn't have given all those lectures on philosophy of history. Anyway, he introduced this term in German, Sittlichkeit, which doesn't really have a convenient English translation, but we can call it a political ethical community of practice. Hegel was quite right in pointing out that a lot of theoretical constructs, namely he was criticizing Kant, namely, don't really leave much in the way of making concrete what Hegel calls abstract rights, and they're basically rights that Kant had introduced in a very coherent and consistent manner, I must say. So Kant did quite a bit of work in this area that we can use. But the idea of social capability that I will get into soon is that we actually should respect a social individuality, and that means we really need to understand and unpack really and understand the social basis of individuality that liberals rightly respect but are not always quite clear about in their own theory. So I will say more if people want to discuss, but let me run ahead. There are problems of practice, however, even if we have theory, and the theory itself needs to be developed. Even under what Raggi had called embedded liberalism, what Lane actually called a muscular American liberalism, we did have problems. One is hypocrisy, but hypocrisy, somebody has said, is the homage that vice pays to virtue. So by itself, hypocrisy is shallow, but it recognizes that you can't just say that you are doing certain things in a cynical way, just like the Millian dialogue, the famous or infamous Millian dialogue in Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. The second item here I'm not really very fond of. This is self-righteousness, and Michelin mentions Puritanism. That is one of the problems, legacies of Puritanism, but Puritans don't have a lock on self-righteousness. This seems like one of those human weaknesses that transcend cultures and historical periods. One thing I do want to focus on is humanitarian imperialism and the unipolar moment, because this is something that liberals need to come to terms with more carefully and more honestly than they have. Liberal challenges are also real. I think it is quite right to say that people who think they are leftists but actually are dogmatic and self-righteous think that human rights as expressed in this great document are just a facade. They are really not, although Lord Curzon, who knew a lot about imperialism, did quite honestly mention that British imperialism should use a facade. And that's an interesting discussion in itself. But actually, Eleanor Roosevelt or the people who followed were not quite so cynical. But neo-fascist challenges are also very, very important, and we can discuss that as well. But humanitarian imperialism did become a serious issue, at least from 1986 to 2001, and sometime after that too. People like Ignatieff, who are reputed to be liberals, in fact are liberals, started defending America's empire and claim that America's empire is not like empires of times past. A global hegemony whose grace notes are free markets, human rights, and democracy, enforced by the most awesome military power the world has ever known. And Thomas Friedman, not to be outdone, was more muscular, and he said, the hidden fist that keeps the world safe is called the United States Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps. Well, you get the idea. But there have been saner voices. Noam Chomsky is one of them, and he pointed out with great logical and historical cogency that this was not something new. Imperialists have always used expressions and arguments like Ignatieff and Friedman, and also other historians at that time who jumped into action. Finally, I want to quote something from Jean Primont from the book he wrote in 2006, actually in French. It appeared a little earlier. And he says, people who have been appealing to human rights for 30 years in order to flatter the American superpower risk finding themselves, perhaps against their will, the objective allies of monstrous undertakings. In any case, the question of soft landing after the passing of post-World War II US hegemony, I added that parenthetically, is the major problem of our time, as well as the principal challenge that needs to be met by progressive peace or global justice movements. And we can legitimately raise the question, have we thought about this problem deeply enough in the last 12 years? And I'm afraid that we really haven't, especially liberals really haven't. But there are some steps towards progress that we can make theoretically and practically, and I would actually emphasize, like Micheline did, practice, because that is very, very important. And we should always unite all who can be united tactically, and then, of course, we should work strategically towards deeper and greater unity. We need to get beyond a shallow universalism that actually, as Dipesh Chakravarti points out, is fairly provincial. We also have to get beyond shallow relativism. When anthropologists, great anthropologists, I should say, like Franz Boas, introduced cultural relativism as a methodological principle, it was actually a great anti-racist and anti-imperialist principle. But today, relativism has been reduced to something that defends all kinds of shallow practices and sometimes actually very nefarious practices. So we have to be much more clear about this. We also need better historical research cross-culturally, and some of that is happening as more and more people from former colonized countries take part, as more women take part in various fields. These really have been happening. And we also need better theory-based empirical work, and some of that has been happening too. If you look at just the last few years of the journal Human Rights Quarterly and the articles there, you'll find that a lot of really interesting work has been done. I read one article that really intrigued me. It wants to defend the right to resistance, human right to resistance. I have defended right to resistance in a different way, but this is really important, I think, to think about these issues, and then to do theory-based empirical work. So what kind of empirical work am I talking about? We need to have a better understanding of causality in a complex systems and do more field work. We need to pay more attention, I think. There are these natural experiments already in history. We need to do statistical work carefully in the light of human rights theories. And we need to do what is called work with dynamic panel data and randomized controlled testing and testing and eliminate selection bias. All these are technical issues, but they are really important. We have to work with both theory and practice. And let me not bore you or bother you with more descriptions of models, but this is my intellectual grandfather, actually, as an economist, Jan Tinbergen, who won the first Nobel Prize in economics. And he warns us that the catalog of research that I just presented to you, which is partial, can actually also get in the way of getting to the truth. Truth, by the way, is shorter than fiction, so I will finish my truth soon. And he also pointed out, and I agree with him in this as well, a just social order can best be described as a humanist socialism, because its goal would be the establishment of equal possibilities within and between all countries, and at its base would lie universal human values. And universal human rights, as we work to deepen them and broaden them, can actually fit this requirement. Thank you.